validated by next June, not December. All those kind of marvelous, easy topics. I'm talking about racism and sexism with teachers and parents and students. Oh. I am a child of the 60s, and this makes me very nervous. I got that from Laura yesterday. That's very, very uncomfortable. But I am affectionately known in Montana as the gender cop. Really, I am here as a groupie. I came with the band. I'm one of the oldest groupies that they have, although that's not quite true. They are my best warm-up act. So if you saw them last night, you're ready to talk about some of this stuff today. I have spent the last 10 or 12 years doing international women's rights and children's rights work with the National Council and the World Council of Teachers. That was Mother God saying, hang in, we're going to get more chairs. I have been a lobbyist in Washington and in the state capitol in Helena for women and children's issues. Even have defeated the massive insurance lobby, which I credit as one of my lifetime achievements in gender equity. I have also worked to co-found the Montana Women's Lobby. It's our women's program. Mostly in the church, and my biggest advocation now is monitoring and trying to analyze the activity of white supremacists in the state of Montana with Ann McIntyre and Ken Toole, whom we honored last night with that award. We're very busy folks in Montana. Our region, as you know, has a lot of things to be watchful of. All of this, trying to be a woman of some faith commitment, that there is meaning in all of this stuff, and that victims of oppression, women, victims of sexism, and people of color, victims of racism, and all of us victims of classism, I believe, have some common threads that ought to be binding us together rather than ripping us apart as we are facing people who peddle bigotry and hatred. What I want to do this morning, I've been asked to give 3 separate workshops, but all at the same time. So what we're going to do is I'm going to talk very briefly, hopefully, on 3 topics which are not unrelated. And then I want you to break up in your little cluster groups if you can, and to reflect on the controversial, outrageous things that I try to say to get you to be able to discuss with each other. And then we'll have a few minutes of dialogue, and then we'll go on to the next topic. So I have basically 3 things I want to cover very quickly. You are more wise in all of this than I am. That's my basic assumption of doing workshops. Where 3 or more are gathered, there shall be 5 opinions and at least 10 times as much wisdom as if one person did all the speaking. So I really count on your expertise and your experience to make this workshop really whole for everybody. So what I will do is very quickly talk about headlines on 3 different phases of racism and sexism. One, I will talk about racism and its linkages to sexism, or sexism and its linkages to racism. A woman's perspective, me being the woman. It is not the women's perspective. You hear the difference. We will together decide what that might be. And then I've been asked to talk about sexism in the church. The church being a difficult word for some of us whose faith commitment is outside of an established denomination. But I am going to talk specifically about the established church as an institution, and the institutionalized sexism and racism in it, and some of the implications then for us as people who live in both a faith commitment and a society. And then I want to talk about women in the white supremacist movement, which is one of my major things. Not too much written about them, but I think they're a fascinating phenomenon which really are the radical, violent combination of racism and sexism. It's the area women's league in our part of the country, Klans women, the women's cells of the Christian Identity Church. So we'll talk as well as women's skinheads, which we have in this region, certainly. So we'll talk just a very little bit about them. There are 1,000 resources I can recommend to you, but I won't do that. you are the best resource that we have, I think. So let's get started. I had asked for, oh, there it is. See, it's magic. That too is a big commitment, I know that. It's also, I warn you all, I move around a lot, so you may have to travel with that too. Okay, thanks. Before I get going, I want to share with you my favorite book of the moment. You all have those books of the moment, you know. This one is about female and male mystique. I actually have two favorite books. This one is by Miedzian, M-I-E-Z-I-A-N, Boys Will Be Boys. It links the masculine mystique in North American society with our propensity to violence. And I encourage you to read it. I don't buy all of it. You won't either, but it is an extraordinarily interesting perception. Another book that I recommend to you is You Just Don't Understand by Deborah Tannen. You know that one? I'll write these up for you. I think a lot of the roots of misunderstanding in male and female, and they often end up in racism and sexism dynamics, come from our different styles in communication, our different purposes in communication. And Deborah Tannen talks about that in that book, so I recommend that to you. Well, I have written my notes down, so I won't go very long, so I apologize for not wandering in this room, which is what a good, equitable teacher does, is gets close to every single one of you in the space of the hour, but I won't do that. And I will follow my notes, which is not my style either. I usually like to go in and let's get into it. But in order to be brief, I'll follow my notes so that you can talk as well. I want to talk about racism and sexism really quickly. And my marvelous articulate husband last night shared with you some of our understanding of how it works. I want to talk for a minute about some similarities, and I want to talk about some observations from a woman's perspective, mine. You all can't see this back here. You're not going to be able to anyway. I'll explain it to you. My functional assumption about racism and sexism is that it is all oppression. Oppression spelled by any manner is still beginning with an O, still demeaning, humiliating, and is an issue of power. If oppression were likened to an iceberg, we would understand that we see peaks of it at different times that may appear to be separate and may be to some people's advantage to treat them separately, right? But in fact, down below the conscious level, below water, 90% of its poison is below consciousness. This is what we say in education. 90% of it is below water, but it is all connected. And that's what I want to talk to you about right now. Some of the similarities that I see in my reading and my working in schools, in administrative boards about the similarities. They're both based on faulty information that is perpetrated to be fact. Both of them are. They are not so much issues of sexuality, of culture, of race, of language, but they are issues of abuse of power. Clearly. They both utilize what we call the 3 L's. My pastor preached a wonderful sermon about that last Sunday. Labels, limitations, and low expectations. Low expectations being the sleeper poison, which destroys our self-esteem, which keeps our kids from achieving the best that they can, keeps us as workers from achieving the best that we can. We do a lot of damage to ourselves. They are both clearly issues of violence. And crimes of sexism, crimes of racism, in my opinion, are hate crimes. There are hate crimes against women. And I'll talk about what those are in a minute. This is a fascinating, this next one is a fascinating principle. Peggy McIntosh is a feminist educator and she's done a wonderful paper talking about male and female perspectives on racism and sexism. And what she says is there are unacknowledged, unearned packages of privilege. And when we talk about racism, white people have it. It's this extra bag on my shoulder that I do not acknowledge is there. I don't act as if it's there. If you tell me that I have it, I'll deny it. For a male, it is that extra satchel on his back or his shoulder that is in fact unearned, unacknowledged privilege as a male. He will deny it. He will assume that he is the norm, he is the ideal, he is the average, and that privilege is not there. So she calls it the package of unearned, unacknowledged privilege. Now, this has been, I'll give you a clue. Because this stuff exists, because men are walking around this room with a package of unearned privilege in this society. And I'm not male bashing, I'm just speaking the truth. And that's a joke, you all. And because I, as a white woman, am walking around with a package of unearned, unacknowledged privilege, in order for me as a white woman to begin to deal with my own racism, at the same time I am dealing with sexism of my husband, for example, the way I can deal with my own racism is to examine my privileged, unacknowledged package as a white person. I can acknowledge and begin to examine the privilege I get as a white person and begin to understand and help my male counterparts understand they have that package on sexism. And if I can take my rage directed at sexism and understand that my sisters of color have a right to be enraged about me because I carry a white, unacknowledged, unearned package of privilege, I will be far on the road to dealing with racism and sexism together. Does that make sense? Isn't that a wonderful image? Unearned, unacknowledged package. The tool for recovery in both sexism and racism, in my opinion, is relationship. That's a biblical phrase. I use it as such. To be a friend in a biblical sense is to speak the truth to someone. A friend is not, the opposite of friendship is not necessarily being an enemy. The opposite of friendship is betrayal, not speaking the truth. So the way we recover from sexism and racism is to become in relationship with someone who is different from us. With my African American sisters, with my Crow sisters who are bringing me up right in Montana, and I give thanks for them. One of the other key similarities between the two, an indicator of how well you're doing in your recovery or how well you're doing in suppressing your acknowledgement that you have privilege is language. Exclusive language. And if you want to press my button, those of you who know me in this room, it is to press it on language. It is not trivial. It is not trivial. Calling God a man continually to me in my faith communion meetings is not trivial. It is violence to me. Calling God a white man with a beard on his throne is not trivial. It is violence to people of color. Clearly, it is not trivial. And it is not, as I heard some people in a workshop yesterday say, it's just that I don't think. I just don't think. I'm sorry. We can think. We have a responsibility to think. Am I right? Right. That's a hard thing to say to some people who are struggling with language, but especially in the church, this is a flashpoint issue for women and for people who are marginalized because of race and culture and language. That's a big indicator. And that's why we make such a stupid big deal about it. The men in my church said, come on, don't be such a hysterical, sensitive woman. Get off this language thing. Well, I'm sorry. I won't. One more comment, and then I'll let you break and discuss. And these are observations as one woman, and they are based my experiences and I'll share those with you. In my opinion, when issues of politics of race and sex are mixed, and they are both present in a situation, it has been my overwhelming experience that the issues of race will dominate the issues of sex. That may offend some people, but let me share with you my experience, and I want you, when you break up, to share your own experiences. In education, I gauge how we're doing in recovery towards equity in education by what we make fun of, our sense of humor in schools. Let me share with you what happens in Montana. I am born and raised in Washington, D.C., and I'm born and raised in an African-American neighborhood. So I'm very sensitive to what we used to call blackface humor, you know? When we were in school, even in D.C. when I was in school, blackface humor was part of school spirit activities. Now, this was 50s and 60s. So when I came to Montana 20 years later, I find blackface humor is not tolerated in our schools. It's just not done. Not because it's illegal to do blackface humor in schools. It's just insensitive, racist, everybody agrees, and we just don't do it. Even in Montana, Lord have mercy, we are doing less and less of the noble savage humor against our American Indian brothers and sisters. And I'm delighted about that. It is less and less tolerated. It's just not thought of. But let me tell you, the most prominent form of school spirit humor in Montana that I have found is the satire of women's secondary sex characteristics. It is the big busted half-nerf balls under red t-shirts with the lewd sexual names done to honor my female state superintendent of education when she comes to visit. And when they see her go berserk and give them her lecture 101 sexual harassment in schools, they're a little startled. But that doesn't make them stop it. In Montana, some of these mockeries of female bodies have 25 and 30-year traditions. And I hear such things as, when I say, listen, in my opinion, that contributes to sexual harassment, hostile environment in this school. And the male teachers say to me, listen, it's a 25-year tradition, it was good enough for me, it's good enough for my wife, we went through it, we love it, knock it off, you're just a hysterical woman. Women say to me, mothers of these young men who dress up like this, say sexual harassment is good therapy for my son, they have every right to experiment with every single way they want to deal with a young woman, so when they grow up, they know the right way to do it. You tell me how you'd answer that comment over a telephone when you get it. That's an issue of internalized depression. We'll talk about that in a second, the phenomenon of internalized depression. I find also, internationally, when I've done women's rights work, I have worked with many women's organizations, globally, Gabriela in Manila, and also the women's organizations in Argentina, Los Cosos. Those women found that when they fought the liberation of their nation, side by side with their menfolk, that when liberation for the people came, the women's agenda did not get incorporated into the new constitution. And those women leaders were not elected to the new parliaments. You hear what I'm saying? I'm concerned about that, because we are valued as comrades and warriors. You'll hear that language when I talk about women in the area in a few minutes. But in a different sense. But when it comes to sharing real power, valuing real contribution for the long haul, we are left behind. I have also some sense of concern, and I know this is a hot topic. I am, in a sense, still gut-shot from what happened 2 weeks ago or last week in Washington, D.C., my hometown. I was there during those hearings. The garbage that we listened to in the hallways and in the airports on the way home was worse than anything you hear on television, and I tell you, I do believe that in a situation where the qualifications of a human being should have been the focus, and an issue of sexist behavior should have been the focus, that as soon as the word technological lynching, the issue of racism was raised, people who should have, and I blame my liberal Democrat friends, who should have addressed the sexism issue. I don't say that it would have been fair to crucify Clarence Thomas on that issue the way they crucified Anita Hill. I do believe that as soon as that issue was raised, the issue of sexism took second place, and in fact became the victim of the whole operation. Regardless of not of whether you believe one person or the other, issues was very clear. Our congresspeople are very nervous about issues of racism. They feel like they can explain themselves away about issues of sexism. They have a whole 8 or 9 months to do that, and they're going to pay through the nose, hopefully. But who knows, right? I wonder, honestly, how the dynamics might have been different if Mr. Thomas had been an Anglo or Euro-American person, and had there been the only issue been raised been a sexism issue. I'm not condemning, I'm not pointing fingers. In private I will, freely, but not here. I think that certainly it is worth our analysis when we talk about sexism and racism together. Certainly, I also believe one of the other items for me, which is very true, is that there is less recognition of crimes against women and young girls as hate crimes, as there is recognition of crimes against people of color, cultural, racial, language, minority persons in our country. Not so minorities, I don't like that word. There is less recognition of crimes against women as hate crimes as there are crimes against people of color as hate crimes. The reason why I'm concerned about that is I think we live in a woman-hating and a child-hating society. I say that as someone who deals with women and children's rights in schools where I see it all the time. And it's very ugly. Let me share with you some of the hate crimes against women and girls that I know about. There's a woman raped in this country every 15 seconds. There's a 50% increase in sexual violence against young girls ages 12 to 25, and some of you are in this room. Over the last 2 years, there's a 12% decrease in violence against young boys of the same age category. We have 40 to 50% of our women in the workplace are sexually harassed. In my church, it's closer to 61%. 77% of clergy women in my church are sexually harassed. Reported, which is usually underreported. 3/4 of the elderly poor in this country are women living alone. The fastest growing segment of desperately poor people in this country are single women and their children. And one of my most frightening indicators that I do a lot of work on in secondary school, as you well might imagine, is that we have epidemic on university campuses in this country, gang and acquaintance rape. Epidemic proportions across the nation. And a recent study about 6 to 8 months ago was really troubling. The vast majority of the perpetrators of gang and acquaintance rape on university campuses are male athletes. Now, I don't think that when you sign up for English 101 at Boise State University that you get this permission slip that says, okay, now go out and gang and acquaintance rape. I don't think that happens. There's something that's going on in K through 12 that sets up a male mystique about athletic prowess, or how, even if you're not an athlete, what it means to be a real man includes violence, which is what Miriam talks about in this book. The part of the male mystique that ends up in perpetrating hate crime against women. Well, that's ugly stuff, isn't it? Let me talk to you about this phenomenon of internalized oppression, and then I'll let you talk about all this hopefully semi-outrageous stuff that I've just said. There is one other incredible similarity, I think, between the dynamics of racism and sexism. And it is a strategy of survival for the victim. And what happens is it causes us great pain, great trouble in the anti-racist movement, in the anti-sexist movement. And it's called internalized oppression. Have you heard it before? This is, internalized oppression is the mother who told me that sexual harassment is good therapy for her son. She absolutely defends his right to damage the females around him. Feels absolutely that I am crazy. In fact, told me I was demented and told me if I ever came to her town I wouldn't leave alive. This is an indication of the point to which internalized oppression becomes violence on our own. It is a strategy of survival. What happens is those of us who are victims of sexism or racism get stressed when we are discriminated against. From the time we are 2, we begin to build up a male or a female mystique, an Anglo or a Hispanic or Latino mystique about what it means to be this. Every affront to what our identity is builds up stress in us. And when we discharge this stress, we can get smashed in the face with a frying pan or get phone calls like I get, or we can choose when we begin to internalize the oppression, to side with our oppressors in order to survive, and we discharge the distress onto what we call safe others. We discharge the distress of sexism and racism onto our own, onto other African American individuals. If you're an African American, I discharge it onto other women, as the woman mother did to me. I discharge it onto my own family, my children. My distress comes out in abuse to people who I am safe in dealing with. It is almost like a buyout. In Montana, we call those Native American persons apples. You've heard Oreos. There are all these derogatory terms to label those people who have, because of fear, of lack of support, a variety of dynamics, internalizing the oppression. They begin to doubt their own abilities, doubt their own ability to lead. We begin to say, I'm sorry, as one area woman told me in Seattle, as soon as a woman becomes president, I'm moving to Canada. She really, really believes that. Some of the other dynamics about internalized oppression is it very quickly locks us into the role of the victim. And that's a very dangerous thing to do. I can talk like a victim till I'm blue in the face about sexism. That won't, and I have found that doesn't help me get out of it to become an effective counteractive to it. It is a major cause of distrust in the women's movement. It is a major cause of distrust, I suspect, in the civil rights movement for racial and the racial and cultural language discrimination. It is how we, in fact, say to survive, I'm going to sell out. I absolutely have no power myself to confront this, so therefore I'm going to take the safe route, which is to look like one of the oppressors. This is really tough stuff. I think it is what our enemies, if I can use that difficult word, like to use the most against us. There are women in sexual harassment trainings that I do by the millions, it seems, the last 2 weeks. There are women in these trainings that say to me, yes, but you know, the way women dress and the way women act, and they invite this behavior, they bring it on themselves. These are women who say this. And now, the men in the group who do not want to deal with the hate crime of sexual harassment will say, come on, Pat, you're really kind of way out on a limb here. Look at all these other women in this group here saying these things. You've experienced it, have you not? Mm-hmm. And it makes it difficult. I don't condemn those people necessarily. I have to understand it is a strategy of survival, and there is extraordinary pain in those people. All the while they're hurting the dickens out of me. It will divide us as we work for whole ability, equal access, equal outcomes, for us to be whole human beings, regardless of the shape or the color or the politics of our skin. What I want to do now, I've said enough outrageous things. I want to give you about 5 or 10 minutes to turn to your friends. Introduce yourselves first. Please do that. Share who you are and where you're from. Really quickly, I'll give you 5 minutes to reflect on anything that I've said here that makes sense to you. Or doesn't it?
Wonderfully animated, and hopefully that means there are learning moments going on. As we say in the controversy business, learning moments. Okay, anybody want to share a word or two about what your discussion was about? Not all, but just a word.
I think one good comment from this group that with the awareness that you're bringing up, it's hard for men to realize what's friendliness and what's harassment.
Good point. If I did like Jesse, you'll Try to repeat to them. I don't like to speak for pictures.
What was brought up here is that with the new awareness, it's difficult for men to know what's friendliness and what's harassment, what's acceptable and what isn't.
One of the solutions, of course, is that we talk to each other. Lord have mercy. And the other flip side is that we listen to each other. The most important, least practiced interpersonal skill in the United States. open heart and open ears. Yes.
This doesn't have anything to do, but with what we're talking about, there's a brown Chevrolet truck.
But it is more relevant than what we're talking about.
The lights on, and if you own a brown Chevrolet truck, you ought to be worried about not having a battery.
That's right, that's right. Okay, anybody else want to share?
The thing that I am becoming more aware of as I go to conferences like this is what you just said, this unearned, unacknowledged package of privilege that I carry as a white female in this society. And I'm now learning that some of this anger that I feel at men has something to do with this package. I mean, it's all tied together. And finding a direction for this anger is, and also unloading that package. It's just a new level of awareness, I guess.
Right. Very good. Anybody else? One more person share. Go.
The teachers aren't helping in high school either.
How many teachers in the room? How many teachers? All right, listen up, teachers.
In my health class during the introductions, we were asked what we look for in men and women. And like half of the men in this class are saying, well, like what she said was a D cup. And when I said that I look for intelligence and I want to have a good conversation, they looked at me like I was a freak. They looked at me like, God, he must be gay, you know?
Oh, that's another whole workshop. You're right. You're right. Excellent. Excellent. Let's go on. There are many more things we want to say. I want to say a few more outrageous things, and then we can talk a little bit more, and we can get some more back. My parting shots to you on this issue are that we are all in this together. Don't forget the iceberg. We do not have the luxury of being single-issue civil rights workers. I do not have the luxury of being a feminist, being a women's rights advocate, a child's rights advocate. I don't have that luxury. I must work on my own racism and help other white sisters work on their own racism. People who speak the most truth about that to me are my sisters of color. I mentioned my three River Crow sisters who are very, very prophetic to me. We do not have the luxury, you men do not have the luxury of being civil rights workers and being anti-racist workers. You don't have that luxury anymore. I'm telling you. This is your mother, listen to me. You must be active women's rights and children's rights advocates. You must. There's no bottom line. We white people in this room, white women, do not have the luxury of only being feminists. We must be anti-racist racists. You hear my language? I will be a racist all my life because of how I am born and raised in this white-dominated society. All my life, I will be a recovering racist, but that is my job. It is my job. I am also a recovering sexist because I do have an internalized depression of sexism, certainly. You'll hear it in me today. We don't have the luxury of being single-issue activists. And at the end of this hour, I'll give you a whole lot more targets to deal with, certainly, and then you're done. We have one thing I think that will hold us together, and that is violence. I have found when I talk with women around the world, when we talk about power access to be elected to the legislature or the parliament or whatever, when I go to Argentina and I talk with my sisters down there about, come on, let's run for office, and they're still trying to raise a decent living to feed their children, we don't have many meeting of the minds about parliamentary power. Many women around the world are still dealing with survival and escaping the absolute terror of violence against women and children. I'm saying to you that if we take on nothing as a Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment, we should take on the elimination of violence against women, violence against people of color, violence against gay and lesbian persons. Violence will hold us, the issue of violence will hold us together, both in the church, in a faith communion, and outside, in a society going berserk, looking for meaning. I do believe that women have the responsibility to help our men examine their package of unearned, unacknowledged privilege. And that to me means that men of color have a particular responsibility to examine the fact that just because they can't be racist, it doesn't mean that they can't be sexist. I have many men of friends of color who are men who say to me, I'm not racist, so therefore I'm not sexist. My sisters here in the room will attest that that doesn't necessarily go that way. Men of color have particular work to do to examine their unearned privilege as a male. White women have a particular job to do of examining our unearned privilege package as a white person. Because I'm a feminist, and I hope I am less sexist than I was a few years ago. It doesn't mean that I am not still a racist. You hear what I'm saying? White women and men of color, we have lots of work to do. We all have lots of work to do on our heterocentrism and our homophobia. That one is a major, major pain, certainly in Montana, as you can well imagine. It is a major issue of sex discrimination, in my opinion, in our state. Untouched, undealt with, unacknowledged. Here comes Pat, she's going to say that bad word again. Let's just, turn her off for a while. All right, my next set of outrageous things to talk about is the church. Oh, don't you love it? And I'm not going to church bash, and by the church I mean establishment church. Many of us are of faith communions, are of faith commitments that may not have an established church, but I'm talking about the institutions that many of us have devoted years of our lives to, have been hurt very deeply by, excluded by, etc. There's an extraordinary panel of women who are going to respond to all of what I'm rambling on about here today, but especially about this section, about bigotry in the church. And they're going to speak after lunch. I encourage you to go to support them. I wish I could hear them. We have 10 or 12 hours in a blizzard to drive, so we're probably going to have to. The band is leaving, so my ride's leaving, so I'm going to. See, that's the nature of a real groupie. See, I have responsibilities here, but my ride's going. It's a band. And somebody may ask me for an autograph, too. I want to talk about bigotry in the church, and I'm talking about the established church. How many of you are established church types? Okay, the rest of you can enlighten us about the ugliness of our own institution. I really think that in my 12 years as a nationally elected leader of the United Methodist Church, and I will speak primarily about the United Methodist Church and let you and your small groups reflect on your experience of the established church, and the extraordinary women this afternoon will reflect on their faith communion, on their experience of it also. The church has a dual role, at least two, lots more, I know. Besides being prophetic, pastoral, and all those kind of things. It has a dual role that I want to focus on here today. One is, in fact, the church is a mirror of society. And in addition to being a mirror of society, we are looked upon, whether or not we acknowledge that power, we are looked upon as the conscience of society. Now this puts us in an interesting dilemma. And if this is your faith communion establishment and this is society up here, for example, we are at one and the same time opening our doors to chunks of society, cross-sections of society, to come in and be part of our faith communion. So every political perspective, usually every economic perspective, hopefully, certainly a diverse cross-section of your community, maybe in your church pews. We cannot help it as a mirror of society, but to have inside our church the same issues of oppression, of exclusion, of discrimination, of hatred, of love and compassion, of excitement. Everything else that's out there is going to be sitting in our pews or in our chairs or on the floor. The other interesting dynamic, which creates an incredible responsibility for us in faith communion that is established in institutions, is that the society looks to us to be what I call meaning makers, make some sense out of this mess. Now, I don't necessarily tune into Jimmy Swaggart to get my sense out of this mess, but how did you know that, right? That joke last night was for me about the back seat. We are, in fact, looked upon as a conscience of society. So how we deal with the ills and the pains and the ugliness and the injustice of the society when it comes to us is in fact flipped back to society and says, this is how you can deal with it. This is what we think. Well, that is not always a reflection of justice, of community, of respect, of solidarity as humankind, either with creation or with each other. It is certainly not in all instances the real valuing of diversity as strength, not as something that's tolerated, but the value of diversity being our strength and what's going to help us survive this mess. Let's talk about some of my concerns about bigotry in the church. And I wrote these down so I won't ramble on. It's my favorite subject. When I talk about being a conscience of society, we have a responsibility, certainly, to deal with bigotry and oppression and discrimination inside our organizations as faith communities. We have that responsibility. If we act as a conscience of society and don't deal with it inside our own organizations, then in fact our own fight against bigotry on the outside has no authenticity. As my Indian people say, you're not walking your talk. And it's very easy to see through. Children see through it very quickly. Have you noticed that? Kids can point out frauds real fast. And that's why we should surround ourselves with children and young people all the time. All the time. Also, if we don't deal with our otherness inside when we are in faith community together, we very subtly give society the permission to continue its bigotry and oppression and discrimination. That's not so hard, is it? If we don't deal with it well inside of a faith communion, we give a very subtle permission for it to continue. When that person doesn't have it called attention to them sitting in a pew, they can go ahead on and operate a business, discriminatorily or sexually harass women in their workplace. So it's a very tricky thing. It is a very strong imperative to faith communions to get our acts together. Well, get our acts together about what? My own denomination is what I want to talk about for a second. United Methodist Church is, by many people's standards, one of the most liberal, off-the-wall, far-left Protestant denominations. That's what looks like from the outside. Any of the United Methodists in here have the same thing I do? Oh, okay.
There's a minister right behind you.
Huh?
There's a minister.
Oh, I know. Tom's paid to be a supporter, though, because he's on. You see, he bought, yeah. My bishop is wired to Tom back here. Actually, my bishop, the first Asian American bishop of our denomination, would probably give this speech a whole lot better than I do. He's Roy Sano of Denver. He's an extraordinary human being. And if we had the great joy of having Leontine Kelly, our African American female bishop here, she would scold you all to death. And there wouldn't be any question of what was the right thing to do. Leontine is God herself walking amongst us. That's a very biased opinion. But if you get a chance to hear her, please do. She is power and compassion all wrapped into one gentle, explosive package. Some of the significant work my church has done in eliminating its own sexism is laudable. We have 5 females elected as bishops of our denomination. We have elected 6, and one has passed on to be Council General to Mother God. We actually have 1 out of 9 general agency chief executives who is a woman. We have some great policy that talks about women's rights for choice. We did have until last year a marvelous quota that all of our agencies, committees, groups would be 1/3 lay, 1/3 clergy, 1/3 women. That was struck down last year, which is one of my other indicators. We have some significant efforts in dealing with increasing women coming to our seminaries. Half of our seminaries now in United Methodism are women, which is very exciting. We have done some work on dealing with our own racism, and as a true to an indicator, more work in dealing with our racism as a church than on our sexism. We have, for the last 8 years, as a primary focus, the strengthening of our ethnic and racial minority congregations, recruiting of more American Indian pastors into our churches, scholarships, great deal of money coming out of the Native American Awareness Sunday, denomination-wide. We're talking about a denomination of 9 million people. So even if only $1 is given in the plate every Sunday, that's a chunk of change. So it is in some ways a decent commitment to have a national focus like that. But my church, just like society, I believe, has experienced a regression in its work against racism and sexism. We had, just 3 years ago at our General Assembly, what we call our General Conference, a full frontal attack by 2 clergy women, the big I.O., do you hear it? Internalized oppression. 2 clergy women came and led the attack to have our General Commission on the status and role of women dissolved, eliminated. There were also 3 people of color who led the attack to dissolve our General Commission on Religion and Race. You hear what's happening? We have it too. There are major systemic movements of the conservative caucus in our church using women's issues as the main frontal attack. Our policy on choice, our policy on reproductive rights and education, our policies on human sexuality, right, and things like that are the major points, flashpoints of ideological difficulty in our church. And it is real tough to get all the men, sorry, no male bashing included, very serious about confronting this fight against our women's rights in the church, as serious as they are already about confronting the attack on people of color in our church. Some of the issues of sexism in my church, and I'll list those really quickly. Pay inequity, clergy women are paid disproportionately less. Sexual harassment, 77.8% of clergy women in our denomination report sexual harassment. By normal standards, sexual harassment is usually underreported by 60 to 80%. That should make us angry in the United Methodist Church. We have a glass ceiling. As a clergywoman, you go so far and that's it. We also have exclusive language, my favorite subject. I did write it down so I wouldn't forget it. The big, big fight about what does our book of worship call God, about our hymnal, inclusive language in the hymnal. This is the real ugly emotional flashpoint around valuing women's perspective, valuing women to do theology. Mercy, we should have women's theology in our stuff anywhere. The big, big hot issue in my denomination is the right of gay and lesbian persons to be considered full, valued children of God. That is a big, heavy, ugly issue. They are not to be ordained in our church as of now. We would hope that the condemnation of their lifestyle would be eliminated at some time. But this is ugliness in my church. And in the last several years, the United Methodist Church has, in response to conservative movements, withdrawn further and further its support of ecumenical movement. You know, the big bad NCC in the sky there, you know, let's not get involved with all those communists that, you know, sell guns to the people in Angola or whatever. The frontal attack at the ecumenical movement has always been on the program to combat racism in the World Council of Churches. And the Slam of 60 Minutes, Reader's Digest, they all love to jump on our ecumenical community as people of faith because we deal nose-on with issues of sexism and racism in those ecumenical arenas. Our church is pulling back, trying to pull back from its behavior there. Well, these are probably subtle indicators for you. They're not so subtle for me, who's invested 12 years of my life defending this institution, trying to change it. My comment to you is that I do know in the state of Idaho there is faith-to-faith violence and bigotry going on here. There is, I'm trying to recall the article that I read about the Muslim mosque being picketed or something. I mean, you all know these details. You talk about them in your group. There is the phenomenon of anti-Mormon activity in the state. There is, we put these God labels on bigotry from the church. So we have those phenomena to deal with responsibly as our own communion of faith. Internally, we relegate women to the position of study circle sitters, fundraisers, nurturers, self-sacrificing people for everybody in the church, not just your own kids, but everybody. Potluck servers and cleaner-uppers can read the Bible every once in a while as a liturgist, but Lord have mercy, you let her preach. It's a very dangerous thing to let me preach. But I shouldn't be ruining it for all of you. The literal use of the Bible is particularly damaging to women. I wanted to ask the gentleman yesterday from the conservative faith communion when he talked about the Bible is the literal authority for our lives. And I wanted to ask him about the Old Testament sections about women when they're having a menstrual period, can't cook, can't serve the men in the family, all those things. You asked Rusty, I adopted that a few years ago and decided, all right, if I'm going to be literal, I'm going to try every bit of this book out. If you have a man child, you're unclean for 20 days, a woman child, you're unclean for 40 or 60 days. All that stuff's literal in the Bible, folks. That's literal authority. Do we deal with that as relevant to our day in the Southern Baptist Church? Probably not. They wouldn't like to guess whether a woman could serve the potluck or not. Actually, the real test, I think, is are we inside the church willing to own up our responsibility as a conscience for society? In our faith communion, are we willing to deal with the tougher issues inside faith communion? Issues that demean women, demean children, demean persons of a variety of racial, cultural, language backgrounds from our own. Are we willing to take this stuff on in the name of the real power and meaning of our faith? We've got to start there, or we have no business thinking we can be authentic, speaking as a church out in the world on the issue. One of the efforts, I think, that shows that the church has a long way to go, and I'll say this to you so you can't say that you've never heard about it. The Ecumenical Decade Churches in Solidarity with Women. How many of you heard about it?
What do you think?
The Ecumenical Decade Churches in Solidarity with Women. It was launched in 1988. See, we're only 3 years behind, and only 5 of you have heard of it. That's great. That's great odds. ERA took us 10 years to get people to hear about it. Ecumenical Decade is an ecumenical World Council of Churches campaign, one, to say women and men together in the church will clean up our sexism and our violence against women in the church. We will clean up our forms of discrimination in the church. We will listen, to women doing theology and spirituality. And 3, we will work for the passage of the UN Convention to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women. The United States being one of 11 nations who hasn't signed that, you know. There are 111 who have signed. I take that back. 111 have signed, 3 have not. We are one of 3. Read my lips. The fact that many communions don't know about the Ecumenical Decade is an indication of how easy it's going to be for us to forget violence against women. The focus of the decade is to deal with forms of violence against women and female children, which is rampant worldwide. Rampant worldwide. Our churches are not dealing with that call for focus. Once again, if the churches were to focus on only the elimination of violence against persons of color and violence against women and girls, it would be an extraordinary, uniting, ecumenical effort for all of us in faith community. Don't you think? I'll give you 5 minutes to turn to your partners and talk for a few minutes, and then we'll end up with the marvelous topic of women in the white supremacist movement. My time.
The question I had
Everybody?
for our group, I was raised Catholic, became atheist, maybe agnostic, and maybe moving towards
United
atheism.
Methodist?
No, my question for any person who is a member of an organized religion is, what is it, why do we convert people? Rather than hear their values, their beliefs, and integrate those and discuss those.
I don't have the answer for that. I would tell you that American Indian people have asked that question for hundreds of years, since 1492. Don't miss the opportunity next fall, by the way, for learning moments on oppression. I think that there are that religion has so often been carried in the white European culture that it has carried sexism and ethnocentrism with it. And that still is why I have a very difficult time with evangelism in my church. I will admit that to you. And it is why there is a philosophical split in many mainline churches that the evangelism I choose to do is social justice work. I intend to tell you that if you believe, as I believe, that there is work to be done in creating wholeness in society, then you may want to come worship with me. But if you don't, that's fine. We can still worship God by doing social justice work together, side by side. And I don't care if there's a UMC on your forehead or not. But that is a philosophical split in my church. We need to get back to the white pastor with the sweet honey by his side with a flipped open Bible going to the jungles of Africa. That there is a segment of my denomination that believes we ought to get back to the good old ways. So it is a tension in established church culture. There is that phenomenon. Correct. One more comment and then we'll move on.
I was just going to comment somewhat like some of what this gentleman said, that there's an extra piece of baggage that people carry too, which is the baggage of being a good Christian. And that if you are carrying the good Christian bag and you happen to be white and you happen to be a man, you know, you can take a position that leaves me in because I choose to practice something and practice in a way that's not like that piece of baggage. So you do have to find a place for that. But like you said, you become the religious institution yourself, and then when you live that, then you're able to help other things, you know, other practices with the That's what we would discuss.
You bet. These are some of the women on that back row back there, the cheerleading section. That's a joke, everybody. Who are going to be responding this afternoon. So please pack that session, will you? You don't have to tell me what wonderful things are said. Let's move on, and I'll give you a quick and dirty, which is also a pun in sexual harassment. I'll give you a quick and dirty on women in the supremacist movement. There is not a whole lot written about this. If you are interested in it, I encourage you to subscribe to my favorite non-advertised dominated journal. This magazine, Volume 1, Issue 5, has a rather interesting overview. It is like Women in Supremacy 101, this article. It will upset your stomach. It should make you angry enough to do something about it. I hope so. And if you are not a member of the Center for Democratic Renewal, I serve on the Northwest Advisory Board for that agency, similar to the coalition. We're based in Atlanta. Our monitor also carries frequent articles about women in the supremacist movement. Well, if ever there were, in my opinion, a more fascinating combination of internalized oppression from sexism linked up with the ugliness and poison and violence of racism, I don't know what it is. Women in the supremacist movement is a phenomenon that is maybe 3, 4, possibly at most, because David Duke opened up the Klan to women. That's why you hear many women saying that David Duke is a feminist because he opened the Klan to women. I kid you not. I kid you not. And that was before he did his bodybuilding. You see, they did some of my material last night too. There have been Klanswomen since 1975, 1980, when David Duke was the Grand Dragon of the Klan. So in the Northwest, the phenomenon is basically from 1988 with the institution, the origination by Monica Wolfing of the Aryan Women's League. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that, and I'll read to you the transcript of one of their hate line messages, and if you're interested in calling up and getting energized some morning, I'll give you that phone number too. The women in the white supremacist movement, make no mistake about it, it is a white male supremacist movement. And if ever I was convinced that that word must be added to white supremacist movement, it is after learning about this movement now of women organized inside the white supremacist, male supremacist movement. I was hoping, when I began to do research on this phenomenon, I was hoping to find women who were captive, who were frightened into this kind of activity because of relationships with men who are active in supremacist activity. You don't find that. You find hardcore, intelligent, self-sufficient, very active, very committed to race purity women who hate other women as much as they hate people of color and Jewish people and lesbians. They have a much more violent commitment to race purity in the case of women's skin days than do women Klansmen or Aryan women. They are hardcore identity people, hardcore Christian identity people. And I want to show you really quickly a little schematic of this. It's in the Ms. article if you wanted to see it. But if you look at this at the top, and this continues out here. Got it? The Klan has a women's movement called Klan's Women. They have a newsletter called Klan's Woman. They have right now an acting Grand Dragon in Georgia, Darlene Carver, who started out as the Grand Secretary when her husband was a Grand Dragon, and he was convicted and prohibited from wearing his robe, so she took over. She would say to you, she's a very autonomous women's rights advocate inside the Klan movement, in that she believes she is as good a leader as her husband. And men and women follow her, but the men will say, she knows really well she can never be a Grand Dragon, because women can't be Grand Dragons. I suspect that we should watch for a real interesting turn in the women's movement in the Klan when push comes to shove on Darlene Carver in Klansmen. This is the National Association for Advancement of White People, David Duke's creation. Also his creation, the Populist Party. The Klan opened up to participation of women in 75 to 80 when David Duke was involved, because they needed to do more, he thought, than make sure the robes were starched and white, and make sure that the holes were stitched up and the burn marks taken care of, etc., as well as making 2.5 babies, at least. John Birch Society feeds members into all of that side. This is the Christian Identity Movement. You know this church, it's active in our part of the world. Christian Identity Church, very anti-Semitic, very racist, talks about Jewish people as satanic. People of color are mud people. You'll hear that word. They are pre-Adamic, so they are mud people. Very, very hateful, religious overcast to this bigotry. There is a women's movement in the Christian Identity Movement. It is illustrated by Sherry Peters. You know Pete Peters from Fort Collins, Colorado, the famous identity church there in Fort Collins. Sherry Peters does workshops on the Christian Identity Household Tips, which is iron every day, set your table before you go to bed, put your laundry in the washing machine and sprinkle the powder over it, so when you get up in the morning you have time to make hot oatmeal and not cold cereal, which we all know these femi-weirdo dyke lesbian women, Jewish dyke lesbian women, are the ones who don't feed their kids hot cereal, which is the downfall of the American family. My children can make their own hot cereal. So does my husband. Christian Identity Movement feeds membership into the Aryan nations, which we know about in this part of the world. That phenomenon, which can be very violent, Aryan Nation movement. And it feeds also the Posse Comitatus, which we have in Montana, that deals with the Zog conspiracy to take away agricultural land and a variety of difficult tax-resisting issues, constitutionalists. A woman involved in some of this stuff up here is Peggy Christensen in Missoula, Montana. Peggy can thump the Bible better than anyone I have ever seen. And I listen to her and I think, what Bible is she talking about? She can justify hate of lesbian women, hate of people of color, hate of modern women, women who have to send their kids to have someone else raise them in a child care because we choose to go to work to make more money to support our progressive, luxurious lifestyles. Any of you have any of those? Have you found one of those? Peggy Christensen is very, very dangerous. However, she has a full-blown staff of accountants and lawyers in Missoula who help people tax resist. Her part of the movement says the 14th Amendment ruined this country. That's the amendment that gave men, black men, the right to vote. That in fact that destroyed the white supremacy that our forefathers insisted this nation be built on. So therefore, you don't have to get a driver's license, you don't have to pay taxes to this government because the government's bankrupt. That's Peggy and, in a nutshell, some of their activity. The Aryan nations, Richard Butler, in your home territory around in here, you know, that whole incredible thing. I didn't put the white Aryan resistance on here. Metzger's people. Metzger feeds, of course, the neo-Nazis. There is a women's movement in the skinhead movement, and they are some of the most violent. They have been convicted of murder and assault. They watched and cheered when the Ethiopian young man was killed in Portland. They tend to be a very violent, very race pure conscious women, and very frightening. The American Nazi Party over here, one of the more violent arms, as is the Order. What I want to focus on down here is the Aryan nations active in our part of the world, but the Aryan Women's League. It's estimated that between 20 and 30,000 people nationwide belong to the white supremacist network, web. And about 25 to 30% of those people are women, loosely organized into white supremacist women's movements. That would give us between 5 and 10,000 women. Now, the Aryan Women's League is loosely estimated to have about 400 women in the Pacific Northwest, mostly, but in 12 states and several foreign countries, one including Canada. And they are called Women for Aryan Unity in Canada. The Aryan Women's League is based in Winslow, Washington, and in the Seattle-Tacoma area right now. They have a hate line, what we call hate lines. You know, you can call and be evangelized. It was founded by Monica Wolfing, who was 22 when she founded it in 1988, and she was most upset over two things: the gossiping and the petty jealousies of women inside the white supremacist movement. So she founded the Women's League to bring women together, to have baby clothes drives, to do fundraisers to help political prisoners in their movement, to produce 2.5 babies, to populate the future Aryan nation, to keep the supply of white Aryan warriors coming to the battle, to the race battle. They are very, what we might call, consider traditional. They use a lot of language of the Judite conspiracy against real women, which is what they consider themselves. I hear very little racist conversation, very little issues of race in their material. It is very, very strongly anti-Semitic, very, very strongly anti-lesbian, and very anti-modern woman who goes to work dressed up in a suit and has a seasonally rotating wardrobe, et cetera, et cetera. Well, let me tell you some of the things they talk about. They believe their role is to serve the man that God has given to rule over them. They believe they are to populate the nation, the new Aryan nation. They believe that they are as strong a leader as their men, but they are to be in a supportive role. They are somewhat autonomous, so they are in some ways contradictory, which will be exciting for us to watch, I think, as that tension builds. When they get more skills, as happened to us in the women's movement, when they get more skills, a little more power, they write their own newsletters, they decide how their own organization goes. She's on the airwaves, on the telephone, regularly. I'm assuming it's Monica that I had the tape of. So it's a very contradictory thing, self-contradictory. It's fascinating. It is still important to them that they seek to enlarge the niche that their mothers had in the Klan, in the Order, in the Christian identity movement. Their mothers only pressed the robe and made sure it was patched and white, raised the children, nurtured the family. They want instead to fight side by side, some of them, on the race war battlefield. They want to do their own organizing. They want to educate women in first aid and self-defense and in how to raise money for political prisoners. Are most of them from Klan families? So what I read says they are mostly mothers, grandmothers, sisters, wives, and girlfriends of supremacist members and activists. Yeah. They are involved, certainly, in real hatred. Their lives tend to be very violent, as what they purport. There is some evidence that supremacist men are very violent. They are not monogamous, and they are physically abusive, emotionally abusive to the women who support them. So their existences are very violent and very threatening, it'd be my guess. Do you hear rings of internalized oppression in these women? If you don't, I think we should. And we should understand they are dealing with a fantasy of a perfect, all-white dominated world where they can live and raise their families and economically things will be fine and nobody will be disenfranchised and everything will be just like it was when Leave It to Beaver was flourishing. A skinhead woman told me in Portland a couple of weeks ago just that she wants to raise her children and live like Mrs. Cleaver. No kidding. And she's the same one that said if a woman ever becomes president, she's leaving for Canada. Now this young woman was 21 or 22. Think how that makes me feel, you know, as a 42-year-old feminist thinking, I'm trying to make a world where my daughters can grow up and have every choice, and here's one who's choosing Mrs. Cleaver. It is what I call a reality check for my work. They are, well, let me read you some of the things of Monica Wolfing's husband, who defends what she does. This is from Baxter the Pagan. This is his new name. The Aryan Women's League isn't some Jew-dyke, we hate white male type of deal. The Aryan Women's League is trying to battle the Jewish mud, zombie, mutant, degenerate, lesbo movement. This is rough stuff. Now, I want to read you a transcript of their newscast really quickly and let you know that I'll cut parts of it out. There's enough hate in here for everybody in this room. This is what she says in 2 minutes. And I transcribed it, and I have 3 solid pages of handwriting. She speaks very, very quickly on this hate line. But this is some of what she says. Are you interested in? Yes. Attention, white women. Do you feel the path to victory is lost to backstabbing and petty jealousies? Of course not. So why does it continue to happen? Here are some of your reasons. You get no respect. You feel you have no place in the movement. You have nothing more constructive to do with your time. The Aryan Women's League is here to offer you an alternative. The AWL is based on the premise that women have a definite place in the struggle for white victory. It does it by working together with our men and not as separate entities. Get the dig? The U.S. media loves to see white Aryan men and women battling against each other and therefore destroying our cause. Let's focus our energy on smashing the Jew-dyke stereotype, and let's prove to them what we really are, strong and healthy white warriors who are the bearers of the future white race. She goes on. The Women's League, we believe, since time began, that while women's role has generally gone through many changes with each generation, we are going further away from the old-time role as the wife who makes the home a pleasant place to be and the mother who raises and cares for her young. We have been taught that to be a real woman is out of date in our modern man society. We've also been taught through school subjects, teachers, here we go, we're in here too, to focus on modern man's future instead of equally teaching us the good ways of the old as well as the new. She goes on to bash modern advertising that glamorizes the carefree modern businesswoman who goes to the fitness club, eats diet food, has a skinny waist, has a rotating wardrobe by season, has a little apartment and a high intellect, and she bashes the media who portrays the woman who stays at home and raises kids with a fat midsection, no intellect, being absolute dunce, stays around eating chocolate, watching soap operas. So we bash media, we bash us. Then she says, another new change in the role of women has come in sexuality. There are gay women who wish to find young women for themselves to love. This type of woman, commonly known as dykes, are teaching young girls that only men can be users and abusers. Some also claim that it's only women that can really love women. These women believe it is perfectly natural for women to have intimate relationships with many others. Both of these women fully support abortion rights and actually do not approve of having children in the first place. They feel abortion is financially and socially the right thing to do. Should they have this view when they aren't actually interested in, when they aren't actually having sexual relationships with men in the first place? We don't think so. Women have been entitled with the knowledge since time began of sewing, cooking, delivering babies, caring for our young, and attending the wounds of our fallen comrades on the field. These are a few things that our mothers before us knew. It's time we made serious changes to the corrupt role of modern man that the Zionist occupation government has thrust upon us. Let's get back to the role of our mothers before us by educating ourselves and our daughters on how to be real women. With our men fully prepared to do battle on the field, we working behind the lines, educating our sons to stand by our side successfully in the struggle for our own true female identity. You can reach the AWL by calling P.O. Box 10212, Winslow, Washington, etc., etc., etc. And then it gives a bunch of phone numbers and addresses.
What city was it in?
This is the Aryan Women's League address is Winslow, Washington. And then there is another city, I believe, Richland, Washington, that is mentioned. Yeah, there's by Bainbridge. This is interesting stuff, and people may say, well, geez, Pat, it's only 400 women. I'm not going to worry about it. I am concerned about it, though, because I think that the supremacist movement is not only radically racist, it is radically misogynist. It is radically involved in hatred against women. It is an incredible dichotomy that they perpetrate hate crimes against other people and against their own women, and that women have internalized the oppression enough that they buy into violence against people of color, violence against other women, certainly. It has violent elements. It certainly is something for us to be aware of. They are, in fact, presenting an alternative to many women, I believe, who are disenfranchised by family, society, work, school, you name it. It is a particular concern to me when I deal with the need for addressing the absolute destruction of female self-esteem in our school systems. What happens to minds that are undifferentiated with values, undifferentiated with strong self-esteem, what will happen to those young women and young men. So I think it is a challenge to us to make sure that we embrace sexism and racism together. We don't have the luxury. As exemplified by these women, they have merged the two. We also must insist that every one of us merge the two. We also recognize that they cloak their bigotry in the veil of church language and the Christian identity movement. Recognize our churches have ways of cloaking its own bigotry in God language too. So let us learn from the work that we must be doing to have hope, because we are extraordinarily powerful people. Speak the truth as often as you can. You can interrupt oppression at any point in the cycle just by offering a counter-opinion. You may pay for it, as some of us do regularly, but recognize you have a responsibility. I think the most incredible thing is that leaders in the movement of civil rights for race justice and the women's movement for women's rights justice are the best ones to be speaking out now. The frightening thing is, the more I go around and speak, we are the prime targets for these people. So the more we speak about them, the more we are targets. So recognize it requires incredible support from each other. When one of us steps out to speak, that you are right beside them, not behind them, beside them. Do more reading on this, and I won't let you discuss this because you need to go to your next sessions, but if you're interested in some of the material on this, get that Ms. issue and watch CDR and the Northwest Coalition paper.
What's ANP?
American Nazi Party. Thank you.